Good Good morning, everybody. I'm Dick Morningstar, and I'm the founding chairman of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And on behalf of the Atlantic Council, I'm pleased to welcome you all here for the U.S. launch of Africa 50's latest report, Investing in Natural Gas for Africans, Doing Good and Doing Well. I guess that's grammatically correct. Anyway, I want to thank our colleagues at Africa 50 and the Energy Futures Initiative, as well as the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. Deputy Director Bron Bruton is here for their partnership on today's event. We're especially excited to welcome former U.S. Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, who is the president and CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative and a good friend of the Atlantic Council. I think you all should know some facts about Secretary Moniz, which you may not know. He is an esteemed graduate of Durfee High School in Fall River, Massachusetts. He still plays soccer, the last I heard. Beginning to be retired now, but up until the last couple of years, he probably is the maybe along with me, we are the biggest fans anywhere of the four-time in this century world champion Boston Red Sox. And he also is the best pitching coach I've ever had. Now, I'm not going to get into that. You can ponder that as to how that might have been possible. And if anybody really wants to know, they can ask me afterwards. But his keynote remarks will set the tone as we kick off this very important discussion about the role of natural gas in meeting key electrification, health, and very importantly, environmental goals on the African continent. Following remarks from Secretary Moniz, we're pleased to welcome a fantastic set of speakers to discuss the report and its implications across the African continent. We'll first hear from Africa 50 CEO Alain Ebibisse, who's also a Global Energy Center Senior Fellow no, I'm sorry. I messed that up. There was a run-on sentence here. In any event, Alain is the CEO of Africa 50. And I might say about Alain, he is very proud because he has just come from Portland, Oregon, where his son, his 21-year-old son, is playing in the playoffs for the Portland MLS Major League Soccer franchise. And now, I was going to say, Global Energy Center Senior Fellow and Principal at the Energy Futures Initiative, Melanie Kenderdine. Now, I could say that you are an Olympic hurdler, but anything you want to add?
I never sleep.
She never sleeps. Because she works so hard with Secretary Moniz all the time. Any event, also to discuss the implications of the report and broader energy opportunities in Kenya, they'll be joined on stage by Andrew Kamau, Principal Secretary of the State Department of Petroleum within Kenya's Ministry of Energy and Petroleum. And today's discussion will be moderated by Randy Bell, the Director of the Global Energy Center. And I want to remind everyone that today's event is public, on the record, and is streaming live. God, if I'd known that, I might not have said all I said in the introduction. Anyway, you can join the conversation on Twitter by following at AC Global Energy and at AC Africa Center and using the hashtag EnergyAfrica. With that, I'd like to welcome Secretary Moniz to the stage.
Well, thank you, Dick, and I do hope you tell the story about the pitching coach opportunity, but anyway, pleasure to be here and to join my colleague Melanie and our colleague and hopefully collaborator, Alain Ebaboussé from Africa 50. I might just say, in terms of a little bit of how we got here, that Melanie and I and a third colleague from Department of Energy days, Joe Heiser, who was the CFO at DOE, started this small group, an analytical / think tank kind of group on clean energy, and established I think a very distinguished advisory board to meet once a year to help shape our portfolio. That group has met once earlier in 2018. They'll be meeting again, obviously, early in 2019. But it was interesting in that discussion. We clearly helped shape our approaches to clean energy, addressing the electricity system, addressing regional innovation and energy jobs, addressing large-scale carbon management as really core areas for which we have foundation support and the like. But we also had one of the members of the committee, Alain, give a presentation on energy issues in Africa. And it was very interesting that this found a complete resonance throughout the entire board, which has as chairman John Brown, former BP CEO, representatives from well-known environmental groups, and many others. But everyone said that energy in Africa issues really had to be part of our portfolio, upon which we will duly report when they get together early in 2019. In that context, what we found was this idea, and Alain then followed up with us with the idea that natural gas development in Africa was a major opportunity for addressing multiple needs, economic needs, health issues, frankly, indirectly, things like women's empowerment in Africa because of the needs to replace certain forms in the rural areas, certain forms of energy supply, energy services, and environmental needs. So in these opening remarks, what I actually want to focus on a little bit is the last one, because, in the context of just recently, literally a week old, the Department of Energy report, for example, on climate change, the IPCC report of a month ago, just amplifies the importance of our addressing climate with some urgency, and that can lead to the question, well, what's this natural gas stuff? Right. So our view is, first of all, I should say, I think this is no secret. When I was in the Department of Energy, I was a strong advocate of what was called the all of the above approach, which means that we start with a completely focused commitment on a low carbon future, but within that commitment, we develop every tool we got because we're going to need them. We're going to need them to get to very low carbon. We're going to need them for a multiplicity of solutions in different regions of our country and in different countries. So that was always part of the approach, and we must remember that today, the United States has made significant progress, not enough, but significant progress in lowering carbon emissions. And the largest single contributor to that has been reducing coal use in the electricity sector from 50 to 30%, roughly, and plus some auto efficiency standards. But that coal to gas plus renewables, and especially gas, has been, again, an enormous part of that lowered carbon profile. If we now, and the United States and other industrialized countries, have got to be on the leading edge of addressing the very, very, very low carbon needs. So now let's turn to Africa. Well, in Africa, number one, today there's about 45% coal plus oil for electricity generation. There is an increasing realization about the major natural gas resource in Africa, much of which has been focused on export markets, LNG export markets, there is a very dynamic situation. Frankly, I think the case can be made that Africa is right now the most dynamic continent that one has in terms of growing the middle class, developing the economy, and the like. So, and in the all of the above spirit, not just for energy, but in terms of objectives, social objectives, the need to have an integrated solution that addresses environmental, economic, health, et cetera, needs, our view is that natural gas, is going to be and should be a major part of that development. And that development inherently means looking at the development of those economies, both in the urban and in the rural context. Doing that is going to require enormous infrastructure development and investments. Those infrastructure investments will look different in the urban and rural areas. They are both important. In the rural areas in particular, and by the way, you'll understand this quite simply if you look at the map of American natural gas infrastructure. Those rural infrastructure needs are going to require some of the very, very interesting, developing, distributed, and virtual infrastructure solutions. I will defer discussion of those technologies to our chief technologists, Alan and Melanie, coming up next. But I think what was important to me was to put this context out that we see the development of this natural gas infrastructure, its integration with economic growth, and other issues as absolutely central, and what we want to continue to work on, and with someone like Africa 50 that is there to make the investments in infrastructure of all types that will help with those multiple objectives. So I hope that helps provide a little context for what we're doing, and again, Melanie and Alain will, I think, fill in with more depth exactly the kinds of recommendations that we have made in the report. So thank you very much for coming this morning, and we're all going to need help, and we will be happy to have your help in executing this kind of a program. Thank you.
Thank you. Ernie, it's always difficult to go after you. Such a good speaker. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I recognize many familiar faces here. Let me start by thanking the Atlantic Council for giving us this platform to discuss what we believe are exciting opportunities in the gas sector in Africa. It's a pleasure to participate to another Atlantic Council event. I did another one in New York a couple of months ago. I'd like to thank also my good friend, Secretary Moniz, for his great support, as well as that of Melanie and the other EFI colleagues. Really, your support is very helpful in our work to try to help our continent fuel its development using natural gas. Indeed, the report that we commissioned, this report, I have to say, I think you have copies in the room, and our increasing outreach through editorials, conferences like this one, but also through actual investment that we'll be making in the gas sector. This is part of our effort to try to become a thought leader and certainly an instigator of new strategies to develop African infrastructure, including through private investment. So at a recent shareholders meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, the President of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, announced an increase in Kenya's shareholding in Africa 50 to $100 million. So I'd like to thank Secretary Kamau for the support of his country. He's here. And also for the great example that Kenya is setting in developing infrastructure, including in the energy sector. Kenya is one of the 27 country shareholders of Africa 50, which is a Pan-African infrastructure investment platform, alongside the African Development Bank and 2 African central banks. So the shareholders have committed over $850 million to Africa 50 to make investments. But more importantly, these shareholders are working with us actively to develop a pipeline of investment-ready projects so that we can attract private investment in Africa. We are not here talking about aid. We are talking about investment, profitable investment that people can make money and deliver good services, because there's nothing wrong with making money as long as one delivers good services. Africa 50 prioritizes investment in power sector, in transportation, ICT, and midstream gas. But all we are doing, we're focusing a lot on building up the pipeline of bankable projects, because there's a challenge. There's just not enough bankable projects today to attract private investments on the continent. So we at Africa 50, we act as a bridge to our country shareholders, and emphasizing early interventions through our project development fund, so we can invest early stage to structure project with a very, very much, I believe, can-do attitude, focus on results. We're not going to spend thousands of years in developing project. We need to get to result fast. We cannot expect things to be perfect when we operate in an imperfect environment. Since we started operation in Africa 50 about 2 years ago, full operations, we've been developing project, financing project, solar plants in Nigeria, Egypt, thermal plants in Senegal, etc. And last month, we announced 2 deals, additional deals that we signed. In Rwanda, Kigali Innovation City, a flagship project of the country, but also a project which is quite groundbreaking, I believe. It's a challenging one, but it's so important. It's a bridge between the 2 Congos, Congo-Brazzaville and Congo-Kinshasa, to connect the 2 capital cities, Kinshasa and Brazzaville. We will do this project. And stay tuned, because we are finalizing all the investment, and we believe we may announce as early as next week another investment in a major project. I cannot disclose it because I don't want to jinx it, but next week probably we're announcing a major investment. Ladies and gentlemen, natural gas is an abundant, relatively clean energy source, and that is relatively easy to produce, store, and transport. It can be used in many sectors, not only in power generation. We want to see natural gas used a bit more, even for industrial products like fertilizers, etc., heat sources, etc. In Africa, we have over 7.5% of the world's known gas reserves. And we're sitting on this bonanza. We believe that this gas can power Africa industrializations and indeed sustainable development. We are Africa 50. We are ready to take leadership role in developing these resources to help the continent reach its full potential. But recognizing the disconnect between Africa's vast gas reserves and the low level of gas use, gas infrastructure on the continent, we commissioned a report from Energy Future Initiatives to analyze the opportunities and benefit of gas development in Africa. The report explores potential domestic demand and the technology that can help increase it and the concomitant supply and infrastructure. The report is an important step in improving investors and African government, giving them the background analysis to help shape decisions and to move forward expeditiously. Again, I wish to thank Secretary Moniz and his team for the excellent work and solid analysis. As highlighted in the report, African countries must develop domestic gas reserves and infrastructure and secure reliable import also via pipelines, LNG, to fully profit from this tremendous opportunity. However, there is a conundrum. Investment in gas infrastructure will only pay off if there is enough demand. And demand will only grow if there is infrastructure in place. There's a number of factors that are holding back demand. One of them is, of course, we discussed it, Secretary Moniz discussed it earlier, the limited midstream and downstream transmission and distribution infrastructure. And this is why at Africa 50, we are making addressing this challenge of infrastructure a priority for investment. We want to invest in infrastructure to make sure that we can bring that gas from the production centers to the load centers, to the demand centers. We are actively looking for partners to co-invest with us. Again, we are not looking for aid. We're looking for co-investors. We put our own money into those investments, and we're looking for other investors to come in and join us. We're also looking at different innovative technologies. Infrastructure that is smaller, for example, for remote areas, cheaper and more flexible. But for the bigger production demand centers, maybe we can go with the traditional distribution networks and transportation networks that we see in advanced economies. But as Ernie was saying earlier, we can do for the remote areas, we have to think about other ways of bringing gas to people, to industries in those areas. Let me end my remarks by emphasizing one thing. There's a very strong consensus today. In my speech, in my written remarks, it's said the growing consensus, but I have to change it to say that it's not growing, it's already there. A very strong consensus among policymakers and key stakeholders on the continents that the countries should use more gas to fuel their economies. Leaders from both gas-rich countries and gas importers have clearly told me that they see a bigger role for gas in their energy mix, along with renewable, but gas is part of the solution, and it's very clear in many leaders. For example, I don't think that I will break the confidentiality of my discussions with President Macky Sall of Senegal, for example, who told me very clearly he intends to use gas that they have in the country to really to fuel the economy of Senegal well beyond the power sector. This is a key strategic objective of the country, and the president himself is very much committed to implementing that strategy. Africa 50 will help Senegal, but I'm sure Secretary Kamau of Kenya would also share the same message, that gas is totally part of the solution of the energy mix of Kenya, and Africa 50 would also help Kenya, and with our other 27 country shareholders that have the similar objective, we work with them to help build the infrastructure through PPPs, public-private partnerships, private investment, profitable return. So Africa 50 is eager and able to help. Not only eager, we're able to help. We have the relationships, we have the local knowledge, we have the financial wherewithal to partner with other investors to make this happen. Again, we want to co-invest with you. We're going to put our money in the project. So if there are folks that are interested in looking at project, we would like to partner with you. With that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention, and I'm happy to continue the discussion during the panel session. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific, Alain. And thank you, Ambassador Morningstar and Secretary Kamau for your support and interest. I'm going to just show you a few highlights from the report that we did. This is animated and I can't see my slides, so I'm not quite sure how to handle this. Anyway. Just want to say natural gas is a highly versatile fuel. Secretary Moniz mentioned that. And these are all the different uses of natural gas, ingredients in plastics, manufacturing of chemicals, power generation, heat sources, and refining, gas processing, efficiency, and process heat. Very important. We have been looking, and you can see some of this in the report, at the regulation, governance, markets, et cetera, infrastructure, as Secretary Moniz mentioned that as well, for natural gas. But this is just to highlight, I think it's in one slide, how incredibly important natural gas can be for economic development in Africa, and which is how we looked at it. These are proved reserves of natural gas in Africa and unproved gas reserves. They are significant. What we also focused on is, of course, infrastructure. Secretary Moniz mentioned that, but also you have to build demand. It's a bootstrapping effort. A lot of gas reserves, recent gas finds, both in Mozambique, offshore recent finds in Mozambique are equal to the reserves found in Nigeria and Algeria, and 57 TCS of gas found in Tanzania offshore. So significant opportunities there. This is urban and rural electrification rates. The green is rural, and let me just read you a few numbers from countries about rural electrification rates. Burkina Faso, 1%, Guinea, 7%, Sierra Leone, 3%, Mali, 2%, and Malawi, 4%. Obviously, natural gas can play a major role in urban electrification, but also in rural electrification where there is significant need. This is Africa charcoal production and its relationship to tree cover. And I'm just going to say a couple things. About 3 billion people cook using polluted open fires or simple stoves in Africa. In much of sub-Saharan Africa, less than 25% of the population has access to clean cooking fuels. To produce charcoal, you are deforesting parts of Africa. The green there are the heavily forested areas. And I'm also a fellow at the University of Chicago. A report was just put out, a study that says for a second year in a row, particulates is the number one killer of people in the world, number one health concern, and so you're getting a lot of that with this as well. It's a problem with not being able to see it. We looked at two scenarios. One is a natural gas infrastructure build out using natural gas imports. And what you see there is international pipelines, but also floating regas facilities. You need port infrastructure. You need that can be used for small-scale power generation, microturbines, reciprocating engines, et cetera, et cetera. And then here, we also have looked at virtual pipelines where you have the port infrastructure, your FSRUs, you don't need a regas facility. Your FSUs, you need a regas facility. But you can ship LNG shipping containers, and there are small-scale regasification units, and you can move that to rural areas. LNG uses are, however, limited. You can use them for heating and cooking, but for heating and cooking, you need a distribution infrastructure. For butane, propane, you don't need that kind of pipeline distribution infrastructure. So there is a difference. These are, I'm going to skip through this, current NGCC plants under assessment in Africa. There's a lot of activity looking at gas-fired power generation in NGCCs. I'll just go through it quickly because I'm taking too long. This is another scenario that we looked at, a large-scale natural gas infrastructure build-out using indigenous supplies, not imports. And you can see all of the things that I showed you in the first slide that you can do if you have large-scale gas infrastructure build-out. And you get ethane and LPGs. you get fertilizers, you get compressed gas, you get petrochemicals, and you can deliver a fair amount of that via virtual pipelines well, virtual pipelines. Show you a little bit about virtual pipelines here. Here's your fertilizers coming up. I can't see this, sorry. These are midstream processing infrastructure, gas processing that you need, gas compression, gas conversion, gas reforming. Additional processing infrastructure gives you wet gas, ethane and LPGs, petrochemicals, and compressed natural gas. And again, these are the consumer products that you get from that midstream infrastructure. I go back to the bootstrapping that you need. You need demand to support the financing of the infrastructure, but you also need the infrastructure. So it's and I'm sure Lan and Secretary Kamau are familiar with this. It's a chicken and egg question. We need to figure out how to monetize flared gas. Global. So there's a lot of flared gas, stranded gas, associated gas. And 7 African countries are among the top 20 gas flaring countries. Nigeria accounts for 50% of all of that gas flaring. There's huge opportunity if you can monetize that gas, and that's something that we looked at. Gas fields of less than a TCF are often not economical without pipelines, and there's greater than $1 trillion of stranded gas assets in Africa. This is what we're focusing on and working on. This is small-scale power generation, and we have, as I mentioned, the LNG shipping containers, small-scale regas, that can be used for microgrids and gas and electricity, but you do need the distribution infrastructure. Something else that we have looked at, I want to show you this, it's fascinating, and I don't know if Mark Lundstrom is here. This is a new technology that is being developed, and it's a little slow to come up here, and they did not have this for Africa. They have it for, this is in Oman, I believe. This is a single gas, flared gas, okay, and it's been burning for 5 years. This is the value of that flared gas, $45 million. 521,000 tons of CO2, enough gas for 62,000 homes in Oman, et cetera, et cetera. It's 100 miles away from a power plant that's burning diesel. So this shows you the flaring of gas, the potential value of that gas. And we have been looking at a technology, it's an airborne virtual pipeline for flared or stranded gas. And it is a combination of a blimp and an airplane. It carries 50 to 200 tons per trip at a speed of 150 miles per hour, and it can land anywhere. So it's a technology that we are looking at and have looked at for stranded gas. As I was reading through the report again, I think it might have value for fertilizer. The road, it's often too expensive to transport fertilizer, but huge need in Africa, and you might be able to move large volumes of fertilizer with this type of technology too. You do need, for stranded gas, a small gas processing and small GTLs. This is the first modular small GTL plant, commercial in the world. It's in Kazakhstan. And I think this could be another valuable technology for the stranded gas that I just described. And then finally, I just wanted, this is a case study done by the Department of Energy, the Fossil Energy Office for Power Africa. And this just shows you 1960s gas was discovered in Mozambique. PPA was signed with those companies, and production started in 2004. The anchor tenant for that production was Sasol, a polypropylene plant in South Africa. They built a pipeline, a 865-kilometer pipeline to South Africa, and it had five offtake points in Mozambique. And you can see the numbers here. In 2004, Mozambique used 0.2 milligigajoules per year of natural gas, exported 120 to South Africa. After they built that pipeline and those offtake points, the demand went to 36 milligigajoules per annum. So I don't know, it's 165 times as much. And so it shows you the value of infrastructure and what you can get when you build pipelines and offtake points going from one destination to another. For the first time in 2014, piped natural gas was supplied to a city in Mozambique. And in 2016, demand for electricity in Mozambique was 1,000 megawatts, and it's expected to triple in the next 15 years. It demonstrates the value for rural or for electrification, what a city can do with that natural gas, and how much demand will go up, and how important it is for economic development. And I think that's the last slide. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Hélène. It's such an honor to be on stage with both of you and with Secretary Kamau. My name's Randy Bell. I'm the director of the Global Energy Center here. Want to have a few minutes of conversation up on stage before we turn it to the audience. I want to start with Secretary Kamau because in many ways, you are where the rubber meets the road on this report. Can you first talk a little bit about Kenya's gas strategy and how this report is informing that?
I think one of the things, thank you very much for organizing this discussion. I think one of the things that maybe we can look at is where we've come from. I know there's been a lot of discussion about demand. How do you create the demand, and how do you get the infrastructure going? And do you do the infrastructure before the demand? If you imagine the discussion that has been there of all the people who don't have access to electricity. So to give you an idea, in Kenya, before 2013, we had 25% connectivity into the power for households. And it really informed a lot of things that we wanted to do. For one, we wanted to encourage the use of the internet. So we started a campaign where all primary school children would have a device, an internet-connected device. The problem was that out of the 26,000 primary schools in Kenya, only 8,000 had connected to power. So that's not going to happen. So we decided within 24 months, every single primary school would have to have power, either on the grid or off the grid. And of course, with that, the families have to be connected to power, and the whole thing of aggressively addressing connectivity started. And today, I think you saw that the average was something like 56 in 2016. Last year, at the end of last year, it was 70%. So we want to be at 100% connectivity by 2020. But it takes political will. You really have to get going. I think the other thing that if you see on the east coast of Africa, there's Mozambique, there's Tanzania with large gas reserves, and they're expensive to develop LNG for export. So of course, we suspect that there is gas deposits on offshore Kenya, but it's a career-limiting move for any exploration manager who finds gas there, because you spend all this money, and then what do you do with it? It's stranded. And a lot of people come to my office and say, I would really like to explore for gas in Kenya, but there's no market. So we decided that we were going to develop a gas market in Kenya. One of the things that's there is that we have about 30% of all our power is diesel or heavy fuel oil. But in our contracts, there is a requirement to convert that diesel and fuel oil to natural gas. It's in the PPA, in the power purchase agreement, if the government can make the gas available. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to start developing gas importation, either by pipeline or FSRU, and then with that, convert all the power plants to natural gas. So already there is a market that is there for power generation. The next initiative that we started is affordable housing. There's a lot of discussion about affordable housing, a lot of healthcare. Healthcare is a very big issue, so universal healthcare in Kenya. And we decided that we really need to bridge the gap, the housing gap, which is about 100,000 houses per year in the market. Right now we're building 10,000. We need to be building 100,000. If you saw what Melanie had written there, one of the uses of natural gas, of course, is the industrial part of it. So everything we have in Kenya, so glass, steel, cement, is for 10,000 houses. We need to get to 100,000 houses. So we have to build all that industry to build the 100,000 houses. We have to have building technologies come in. We've passed a law that water heating has to be solar for all new buildings, just to reduce the carbon footprint. And piped gas has to be one of the things that is in those new houses. So whether it's LPG or natural gas when it finally shows up. So we're really seriously addressing the issue of bringing gas as a central point in the development of Kenya. Right now, because we don't have piped natural gas, LPG is a serious consideration. We're trying to, 80% of the people of Kenya cook with firewood and charcoal. So LPG, with new technologies like mobile banking through the cell phone, I know you've heard about M-Pesa, we are now using that technology to be able to bridge the gap between charcoal, which is a daily purchase thing, and get people to afford to buy LPG in bottle by mimicking the way they buy charcoal and kerosene. I think maybe I'll leave it there.
What's the timeline on these plans?
It's ongoing right now.
Okay.
So LPG is a program that started. Since June to now, on this scheme, we've put out from zero 500,000 households, and we want to be at 2 million households by the end of next year. So just like we did on the power, it's exactly the same thing that's going to happen on LPG. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Alan, how can Africa 50 help play a role in realizing this vision?
Well, thank you, Randy, and it was quite interesting what Secretary Kamau Andrew said about Kenya, about this vision of having natural gas as a central energy source in the energy mix of the country. We have decided, we have limited resources at Africa 50, $870 million or so of committed capital. So we needed to prioritize where we would target our investment. And what we decided is that we're going to target the midstream and downstream sector in natural gas. And we would be willing to take a bit more risk than the traditional private investors, because we're willing to bet on the fact that there will be demand. We see the continent with a lot of potential, a lot of demand which is coming. So we are willing to invest in the infrastructure. We are willing to, in fact, I guess, without disclosing any other confidential discussions, with Kenya, we are working on actual projects that hopefully we could announce soon, that will show what we can do in terms of investing, in terms of betting on our country shareholders, because we see very good prospects. And so investing in pipeline, processing facilities, it's what we will do in our member countries to help achieve that gas objective.
You mentioned in your talk, desire for increased investment. You're not looking for aid, you're looking for investment. What are the impediments for outside investors coming in, and what can Africa 50 do to help those investors get more comfortable with this type of project?
Yeah. Look, first of all, it's true that the volume of private investment in infrastructure generally that we see today in Africa is nowhere near where we want it to be. But I should also argue that there are a number of investments which are being made today, which are actually profitable investments. And we don't talk enough about those because private investors, if they see that they're good investment which are actually making money, I believe that there will be a bit more interest in folks to come in. But we also have on our side in Africa to address some of the regulatory impediments, some of the bankability issues that have been outlined by investors. But I do believe that also Africa 50 with others, the African Development Bank, the World Bank and others, we can work with investors to structure bankable projects. We know how to do this. My challenge to all of us, including to Africa 50, but certainly to the bigger international financial institutions, is that we have to be able to go faster. We tend to take too much time to develop projects because sometimes the people want perfection. People want perfection in an imperfect environment. That's not a recipe for success. But those that are able to focus on the big picture, the key things that they need to proceed with investment, they actually end up making money. And we will demonstrate that with the funds that we have, working with our country shareholders to be able to make those investments. I think a number of things are happening, but we need to do them faster and at a bigger scale.
Thank you. Melanie, your presentation highlighting flaring and the charcoal issues. At first blush, that seems like a huge problem, but it's really an opportunity, particularly tying into what Secretary Moniz said about carbon reduction and really having gas play a role in mitigating climate change. Wondering if you could talk about how we overcome those two challenges that you highlighted.
Well, the charcoal production, one thing I would say, I had the privilege of going to Nairobi this summer and presenting the initial results of the report. And I then went to Rwanda and did a tour. And one of the things that they wanted to show me was a charcoal production. I think it appeared to be a very important part of the culture. I think that is an issue that needs to be overcome. And I mentioned the health impacts of charcoal, using diesel, using coal, and the particulate problem. It is a serious problem in Africa, because so much of the cooking is done with charcoal, and so much of the power generation is particulate emitting. I think that natural gas will help tremendously with that issue. I like the idea of accelerating project development that Alain just mentioned. And I like the technologies and the virtual pipeline technologies that we are working to identify that can be used to address the cooking fuel issue. On climate change, I think Secretary Moniz addressed the climate change issue very well. We need to be able to both address climate change and promote economic development at the same time. And I think that natural gas is a way to do that. And I am excited about that possibility. So.
On the economic development side, it's something that each of you have touched on one way or another, is the role that natural gas can play in the industrial sector, whether you're talking about process heat or talking about gas byproducts, gas products. leading to fertilizer, leading to plastics, et cetera. Often we talk about residential power, which is crucial, but what role will providing more power and bringing gas to the industrial sector play in helping development across the continent? Why don't we actually go down the line? Start with the Secretary.
I think one of the things that, of course, in order to have serious economic growth, you need cheap power. And gas is one of the ways to get there. Diesel is too expensive. Hydro, we have limited source of rivers, but there are other countries like the Congo who have serious rivers. But for Kenya, we don't have that option. We've got geothermal, but it takes time to punch holes in the ground. Yeah? So you can actually bring in 1,000 megawatts at a time on natural gas. So all this stuff I'm talking about, these industries, the only way you're going to bring down the cost of housing is cheap power. And gas gives us that opportunity to bring in industries, and that creates jobs, that creates housing. Those jobs get people up to a standard of living, and that also helps on the healthcare. And those people are not going to cook with charcoal. Yeah. So a lot of these things are really tied in together from a social perspective, development, jobs, health. So natural gas for me is the one thing that we can put in place that will change the economy of African countries.
A couple things I would say that and the Secretary alluded to that electricity really is the Uber infrastructure, the Uber need for industry. You need electricity. You also need gas for process heat. I don't want to diminish the importance of that, but electricity is there's a direct correlation between electricity consumption and where a country resides on the Human Development Index. And so I think electrification is critical for development in Africa. It's critical to run industries. Natural gas is as well. And you can share infrastructures between industry and natural gas, between industry and electricity, and lower the costs of both. If you have the gas infrastructure that provides industry with the elements that it needs, the process heat, et cetera, the manufacturing, the fertilizers, as well as generating your electricity with gas, you're sharing an infrastructure, and it makes it less expensive, quite frankly.
So I think first of all, we have in Africa a lot of gas on the ground. We have the reserves. And as Secretary Moniz was saying earlier, so far most of it has been developing for export markets. Fine, there's nothing wrong about that. But we need to get a bigger share of it to fuel our economies in Africa. And we need sources of base load power, which is reasonably cheap and reliable, to fuel the industrialization of the continent. The African Development Bank has this high-five strategy for Africa, and one of it is essentially industrialize Africa. We need to transform things in Africa. The time when we're selling raw materials and untransformed resources, it's over. We need to transform a few things on our continent so we can give jobs to people, etc. And you need a lot of energy for that. We have the energy on the ground. Let's build the pipelines and make sure that we can bring that energy to the demand centers. A number of countries have plans, and they're implementing these plans. I see my friends from Morocco are here. I think Morocco is thinking about big gas-fired project. Kenya for sure, Senegal. I mean, you name it in Africa, many people are thinking about these things now. We need to implement. We need to stop thinking and doing. And that's where Africa 50, with the limited resources that we have, we have only $850 million of equity capital, but we can help jumpstart some of those projects by funding the early stage development process and get those gas-fired projects implemented or pipelines implemented, etc. We're very optimistic about the prospect of those investments because the mindset is, okay, those investments have to make money. It has to make sense for investors. So let's come in and invest in this gas project and let's all make some money while delivering good services.
I hope next time you're here we can talk about these specific projects and how they're going. I want to ask one more question for all three of you before we turn it to the audience, and that is, how would you respond to critics who would argue that building gas infrastructure essentially creates a path dependency towards a fossil fuel, even if it's a lighter carbon fossil fuel than, say, oil and coal, that ultimately will have negative impacts on the global climate? And why don't we, again, go down the line?
Okay, I mean, that's it's valid criticism. But what's the alternative? The alternative is what Secretary Moniz was saying, coal. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of coal in Africa. Power generation, people are looking for cheaper coal, cheaper power. Let's go the coal route. That's what happened in India, that's what's happened in China. Africa is at the beginning of its, what I like to call, to achieve escape velocity. If we don't get in there now, and that's what I was asking earlier on when we were chatting in the room, how convinced are we about climate change? If we're not convinced about climate change, it's just going to become an academic discussion. If we're serious about climate change, we're going to have to reduce the carbon footprint, and the only way to start doing that is gas. Then, as renewables become more developed, solar, it's a natural progression. It'll happen. But we need to be convinced that what we're doing is really this 2 degrees has to be a serious issue. It has to be a discussion that's had often and everywhere. So we like I said, we have to start somewhere.
You stole my line. When you asked the question, I wrote down, consider the alternatives. Yeah. And I think you, certainly in the U.S., we have one of the largest, if not the largest, reductions in CO2 emissions in the world. And that is the largest component of that. There's efficiency. But if you look at the power generation, it's 61% of our reduction is from switching from coal to gas. And the remainder is renewables. I think in Africa you need both gas and renewables. I think renewables provide a wind and solar provide a significant option in parts of rural Africa. But I would also say when you look at urbanization trends, I think in 2007, for the first time in history, more people in the world lived in urban areas than rural areas. I think there are 3 or 4 cities in Africa that by 2040 will have 10 million people or more. I think you need large-scale power generation to meet the needs of that significant urban population in Africa, and if your options are coal and you use a lot of oil for power generation in Africa as well, gas is a preferred alternative from a climate perspective. And I would echo what Secretary Moniz said. You certainly need all of the above. But there are things that natural gas provides, besides, as I mentioned earlier, its value for power generation, its value for industry and economic development as well. And industry is very difficult to decarbonize. You need natural gas for industry, and Africa needs economic development. So you wrap all of that together, and natural gas, it's the lowest emitting fossil fuel. It enables economic development, it enables industrial development, and it can supply electricity to both urban and rural populations.
So from where I sit, actually the US example is actually a good one in some respect, both because we've seen a spike of industrial activities in some of the states that are producing gas, and also the reduction of the carbon footprint, stemming from the conversion from coal to natural gas. And actually, I'd like to have Secretary Moniz from time to time actually come and talk to some of our leaders also on the continent to further solidify the thinking about natural gas, the benefit, etc. If you look at Africa 50 today, our portfolio of committed capital, those projects that we actually committed investment to, you see that there's a lot of solar projects, renewable projects. In fact, somebody may say, look, are you doing only solar? But no, we are not only doing solar. We're doing all of the above. So we have invested in solar project because we believe that this is, it's a good technology, a good part of the energy mix. But we are also investing in gas project. In fact, we have a transaction which is under development where we will be acquiring a portfolio of thermal plants, HFO, actually not very good fuel, but convertible to gas. We're buying those plants so we can convert them so that they can burn gas. This is part of the strategy. So we're very serious about this gas thing, and hopefully the consensus will grow that this is totally part of the solution, all of the above solution. And frankly, our leaders today in Africa and leaders of the institutions such as Africa 50 and others, we're quite confident today. We're defining the agenda for the continent. So people who are telling us, well, I'm being a bit extremist, okay, do only renewable, we'll tell them, sorry, we won't do it. We'll have all of the above mix, and we'll pursue that strategy and seek partnership for people to help us implement the strategy.
Wonderful, thank you. Turn it over to the audience right now. We've got a first intervention from Secretary Moniz.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a footnote, if I might, to what I said based upon what was said by the panel. And first also, I would like to recognize another of our EFI advisors, Colette Honorable, who is therefore also responsible for getting us into this direction. But Secretary Kamau very elegantly described their strategy, again, emphasizing this question of its both markets and infrastructure in a co-evolution. And I want to remind people about the situation in the United States, where we've increased our shale production by 17 TCF, up to 17 TCF. That started 40 years ago. It hit the kind of the hockey stick change 10 years ago, when horizontal drilling in particular reached certain technical milestones and economic milestones. But that could not have happened if we didn't have already an enormous infrastructure, and we wouldn't have had an enormous infrastructure if we weren't the world's biggest gas market at the same time. So what's really being discussed here is looking at how do you get that 40 years down to maybe 10 years, and that's only by explicit co-evolution policy of markets and infrastructure. So I just wanted to really hammer that point one more time. And secondly, on the renewables, that we are, again, completely supportive and think it's important to push solar and wind deployments aggressively. Again, the cost reductions there have been enormous, but the cost reductions on storage have not yet kept pace. And for some other work we're doing, if you just look, for example, at 2017 data for solar and wind production in California, what you find is there's a lot of fluctuations. You'll find one period of 10 days of essentially no wind or solar. You don't build a system that way without a lot of integration. As Melanie mentioned, gas, because of its fast ramping, is a critical part of a system that aids the deployment of nuclear and solar, while at the same time addressing the much broader application space, like industrialization, that solar and wind do not address. And again, I'll end with another American factoid, that 17 TCF of natural gas has led to about $200 billion of investment in the Gulf region for industrialization. So that's the view of how all of this hangs together. And yeah, it ain't perfect from a carbon point of view, but it's a lot better than the alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Moniz. For the questions, if you can say your name, where you're coming from, and try to keep it to a question, that would be great. John Elkine first.
Hi, Jonathan Elkine from Columbia University, the Center on Global Energy Policy. I want to ask for a little bit more discussion of this point that has been made by Mr. Ebubisse and Mr. Kamau about accelerating the tempo of projects. So one way to do that is to really lean on bureaucracies to move faster. A different way to do that is to shortcut project assessments and so forth. What do you think is the most necessary? What are the most necessary components of an effort to accelerate project development and implementation?
Yeah, take that. Yes. John, great to see you. I think one of the things is bureaucracy. Unfortunately, government bureaucracy. It just takes too long to get it through the process. I don't know if it's an African thing or it's all governments. Maybe Secretary Moniz can tell us. But I think we've been having this discussion, funnily enough, and one of the things that has been floated out there within senior government officials is maybe there isn't enough knowledge of what it is that we are grappling with. So how do you get PPPs done? How do you create incentives to get the deal done and convince policymakers? Because in the back, there are all these mandarins who want the perfect. So the best becoming the enemy of the good. It's just, we want it just so. I think it'll take time, maybe a year or so, once people begin to understand this is what we want. Because don't forget what we're trying to do. If we're shortening 40 years to 1 year or 2 years. Yeah? So is the law there? I know one of the things that we've been working with the Department of Energy here is how do you put those regulations in place? Because they're not there. How do you get those regulations in place so you have a safe working environment for investors and also for the government? So it's really about accelerating the knowledge around deals and then de-risking so that Alain and other banks and other investors are sure that they're going to get their money back. Yeah.
So I think it's a fantastic question, but it's a question that everybody is struggling with, okay? Before taking my position as CEO of Africa 50, I was the global head of IFC Infra within the World Bank Group, and my colleague Pat Seltzer was here. She was my chief counsel, and we observe that kind of slow implementation of project globally in emerging market, which is sometimes consistent with the stage of development of the country. And so there are ways to help reduce that timeline, but there's no silver bullet. I think having institutions such as Africa 50 involved in the development process helps, because we can, through our relationship, try to get to the most senior officials that could make decisions, because sometimes the bureaucracy, Andrew would certainly tell me, the biggest challenge is actually below the top echelon. The president wants something for tomorrow. In fact, most of my conversations with African presidents is, can you deliver this project, soon enough before the next election, certainly, but as soon as possible. And they want it, they mean it, they want this thing done. But then you go below that, things start to become a bit more difficult. So having us involved sometimes with our ability to access folks like Andrew at the high level, even the Prime Minister or President, helps to some extent. But you don't want to use it too much, because sometimes if they know that you have access, then the people start to really be very funny in terms of throwing it down. But I believe that institutions such as Africa 50, but also the others, the IFCs, the African Development Banks, provided that there is a sense of urgency in those institutions as well. I think sometimes the DFIs are also part of the issue because they are very slow in making decisions. That's why we are lucky at Africa 50. Our decision-making process is very streamlined. In fact, one of the presidents was asking me, can you help us in our government to have the same type of decision-making than Africa? I said, no, Mr. President, this is not my job to help reform your government. But yes, we need to figure out ways for decisions to be made fast on the positive or negative side. And that's how we're going to do this. But I believe that ultimately, we just have to make enough of those investments so that there is almost like a demonstration effect. At some point, you have critical mass and things will be faster. In Latin America today, another emerging region, things are done faster. And so they will be done faster in our continent as well at some point.
We have two questions in the front. Here with Serge, and actually then over there afterwards. Serge, the microphone is right next to you.
I'm Sergio Matesco with Total. We are one of the energy players in Africa. Alan knows it very well. I have two questions which are linked actually. Mm-hmm. The first one is for the last 30 years, most of the large pipeline in Africa have not been built. Gas, only the one which has been more or less working is Nigeria to Ghana. Mm-hmm. Can we foresee large infrastructure, regional infrastructure, such as, for example, bringing Tanzanian gas to Kenya or even Mozambique gas to Kenya? And the second one, which has a link with this, since the World Bank and other DFIs have pulled out of the upstream, and there are no more financing gas, don't ask me why, who is going to finance a part of the private sector? The Chinese?
Who wants to take that?
Well, that's either Andrew or me, but
Yeah.
look, I start because Andrew, you started the first time. Look, there is a need to rationalize the infrastructure on the continent, and certainly cross-border infrastructure sometimes makes a lot of sense. But there's another bigger need, which is to do things faster. And so for me, maybe some of the decisions will be suboptimal, but focusing a bit more on what kind of infrastructure I can deliver faster. I.e., I want to work with a country that is willing to work fast and deliver something. And I don't want to sit down and think about, it would be nice to have this nice infrastructure, and it takes me 10 years. So yes, in parallel, we will look at cross-border stuff that makes sense, but in the short term, medium term, I want to work with Andrew to deliver this project that he has in Kenya to get gas to his people and to his industry as quickly as possible. That's my sense. With respect to the question on the World Bank, I used to be a World Bank. I spent about, Serge, I know Serge, so maybe the question was directed to me, so I won't be able to comment as much, but I think gas is part of the solution. Anybody, the World Bank or anybody should understand that Africans are serious about bringing gas to our industries, our people. They make the decision that they have to make. We'll make the decision that we have to make on our continent. Yeah.
I think on cross-border infrastructure, it's not only in Africa. Lots of discussion about Nord Stream 2 in Europe and Russian gas. There's politics around cross-border infrastructure, which has nothing to do with economics. And it's very hard to deal with politics and economics. I think what will happen is that once the gas infrastructure is there in one country, the other country will come along. So like for us in Tanzania, we've already done the studies to build the gas pipeline to Mombasa. We've looked at Mozambique as well, but Mozambique have already finalized their discussion with BP, the ENI natural gas. So there is no natural gas available to us now. We are in discussions, of course, with them. But I feel that intra-Africa trade is going to be the next big thing. So in country, so from Mozambique, now you saw Melanie showed, into South Africa. There will be no reason why you can't go into Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, and then from Tanzania into Kenya and Uganda and all these other places. We really have to build that infrastructure. I keep telling people that, in the 1800s, the British decided they were going to build this railway to Uganda. And big resistance from the UK Parliament. In the end, it was called the Lunatic Express because anybody who supported it was seen to be as such. But I think we need to be lunatics ourselves and build this infrastructure, and people like Total, of course.
Question over here.
Good morning. Daniel Bice, Africa Kilowatt, Tualain. For shovel-ready late-stage project, do you look to put debt or equity in? What percentage do you look to do? And if you had a complete set of documents, in a data room, how long does it take to process?
Those are very specific questions.
Yeah, that's good.
Almost a question for the investment committee. Look, at Africa 50, we chose to focus on equity, quasi-equity, and early-stage project development support because we believe there is a lot of debt in the market for projects which are already, fully developed. So for us, we focus on equity, and what I'm going to say is not cast in stone. We can discuss it, but we like to be a strategic minority, somewhere between 30% equity stake in the project, and we have a very streamlined decision-making process. For us, first of all, we don't have to go to the board of Africa 50. The investment decision has been delegated to an investment committee. So far, 4 people that I chair. They're very strong people, they have views, but we discuss very quickly. If there's a project which is there, we look at it and then we give you an answer very quickly. My sense, though, that typically the projects that are presented to us are not totally fully ready, so it's subject to discussion. But if those projects are ready, we can make very, very quick decisions. You're talking weeks. Because it's very streamlined. Our chief operating officer is here, Carol is here, myself, and then other members of the management team. We sit down, we say, we like this thing, let's do it. And we do it. Or we don't like it, we don't do it. That's so it's very quick. Yeah.
Got a question right here. I also just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone in the back. So are there any questions coming in the back? Okay, good. Not missing you. Yeah, right here.
Thank you. Mima Nedeljkovic, CEO Africa Global and Chairman of Schaefer International. Known more in agro-industry, we're agro-process. But I think what's interesting, I'd like to hear more, because I've gotten more involved now with gas, particularly in Guinea with an agro-industrial park, is there's often the discussion, the thought it's only big infrastructure. But the opportunity, I think Madame raised it, is the ability to kind of step up. It's sort of like an orchestra. Different parts of the instruments need to be coming at different times. How do you prep it up? How do you move it up? So I think this ISO tank, ability to move gas now, being able to move and do 5, 10, 15 megawatts out in the bush with a virtual pipeline is something we're looking at very much now with Bokeh Agro-Industrial Park. And the interesting part, if we really tie into this value addition part, industrialization, not just big, on the agro side, you have the built-in ability immediately to have what? Cold chain, refrigeration. When you regasify, you get the coal, correct? So that ability in one step is really, it's almost a magic bullet for these famous stable crop processing zones of President Akin Adesina and African Development Bank as we develop them. So if I could have a little more just discussion on this agro piece and the smallness stepping up.
Who wants to take that? You Miller?
I should have said I was disoriented because I couldn't see my slides. I have to stop animating them. But I think that I forgot to say that imported LNG right now could be helpful. Okay, because you are importing it to supply the I think electricity generation that then inspires demand growth that helps you bootstrap the infrastructures that you need, both large and small, to meet the needs of urban populations and the needs of rural populations. And so it's a tough problem. I do envy Ellen often, okay, because she has a wonderful job, but it is a tough problem to solve. But I think that, in my view, you have to start by creating the demand. And I would go back to industrial demand too. I think that that's very important. And leveraging the infrastructure by having the electricity demand and the industrial demand will help with the infrastructure across the board. So.
I agree with that. You know, you need major anchor off-takers to have a bankable proposition. And then with that, you build those pipelines. And then after that, you can then branch out to do the virtual small industry supply to different places. And so that's the way I'm thinking about that as well.
I think one of the things that, especially on agro, the whole issue of fertilizer, you know, we've talked so much about food security. The small urea plant is what, 500,000 tons. So you pick a country. You say, well, Kenya is 200,000 tons a year. Ethiopia, maybe another 150,000 tons. And you say, okay, fine, we will build the plant in, I don't know, Tanzania or Mozambique. So rather than, because CNG, because you're not going to build a gas train for that. So you look and say, I can't supply CNG more than 50 kilometers. It's just not economical. So what can I add value? What can I build that'll add value? For example, I'll build a fertilizer plant. I'll do Kenya, I'll do Uganda, I'll do Ethiopia. That's 500,000 tons a year. So I start there. And eventually you can then ramp it up as you grow, because that then brings you the bankability. Those are bankable clients. You can then move to another 500,000 tons. So one of the things that will probably have to be done is, how do you modularize these things so you don't have to build one big plant? Yeah? And this is what's happening with the mini LNGs.
Right.
Yeah.
That's another thing I should have said too, is the small GTL plants, small gas processing. The FSRUs, I think, are important. They can move around. Those things can help you modularize some of this too. So.
Colette had the question.
Yep, one final question.
Okay.
Honorable partner at Reed Smith, and honored to be a part of the EFI Global Advisory Board. So one area we've talked about challenges and opportunities in Africa, and one that Melanie highlighted. First, let me thank you all for your leadership, for your vision. You all have touched on elements of what could be incredible success in moving forward a number of places in Africa, and that is monetizing flaring. Elaine, you've talked about the importance of public-private partnerships. Mr. Secretary, you've spoken about cutting through the bureaucracy. Here we have the resource, and we all see the incredible potential in capturing and harnessing that in ways to move so many places around the continent forward. How can we best focus collectively our resources, our expertise, our ability to engage with those policymakers that are integral to moving these projects forward? Your thoughts?
You're the policymaker. I used to be.
I know it throws me under the bus.
There are a lot of used to be's in the audience, actually.
I think one of the things, and I'm going to sell my own case, is let's do a case study. Let's do Kenya as the case study.
Okay.
Yeah? And say, look, this is what we want to do. Let's bring the FSRU. Because if one person does it, then you have a template. And I think right now there is no template. I remember when I started off in this industry many years ago, There's a lot of discussion and excitement around the West Africa gas pipeline. And we talked and talked and talked, and okay, it got to Ghana. That's great. There's a lot of talk about East Africa. We need to develop a template, and I know we tried that at Colombia. There's a time with Power Africa in an LNG handbook, how to for importers, but it stopped there. We need to do one. And then when we do one, then everyone sees, oh, okay, fine, it's actually possible. So that would be what I would do. We do one, and that's what we're doing with Alain. We do one, and we put all the elements together, because we have all the elements. We have the port, we have a pipeline that is already constructed, we have the power plants, we have the thing about fertilizer, and we have a possibility of having gas one day. So if we can build a gas market in a country that does not have gas, when that gas then does come and it fits into the grid, into its existing grid, you can do it in so many other places. You can replicate that formula over and over and over again.
If I could say one thing too, and it was a slide I took out, so I didn't drone on longer than I already did, where there has been assessment. I'm saying this because it's you, Colette, of the regulatory infrastructures in the different countries for electricity, and looking at some of the ones that are more advanced in that regard. Kenya was certainly one of them, and looking at them because I do think it's important for the investors and for the development to have that infrastructure to develop the power generation and then all the things that come from that. So.
Yeah. I think if I can just say one thing, Alain, before I forget. I mean, Kenya, I think, has something like 16 IPPs. Wind, solar.
Right.
It's a tried and tested model. Yes. Investors show up, and the pipeline is long. But you had to do one first, and another one, and then people get comfortable with the legal setup.
So one of the reasons why we chose Kenya as a country where we want to go full steam ahead to try to implement some of these gas projects is because the environment, we should say, in Kenya is more conducive than in many of our shareholders' countries. So also at Africa 50, because we have a commercial mandate, we happen to have money from government, but they gave us the mandate to operate commercially. We also pick and choose where we can invest and invest quickly. And that's why, Colette, I should say on your question about the gas that is flared, maybe we don't have as much traction in some of those countries to be able to engage and make things happen. Right. So not yet, at least. Right. We are having that engagement slowly. So, but in the countries where we see the opportunity, and I'm very happy that Andrew actually said that Kenya should be taken as a case study, because that put pressure on us, him, myself, Carol, that maybe next year people will ask, so that case study, how's it going? And so we have to be accountable for this, and then we do our part, and working with the Kenyan government, Andrew and others, hopefully we can deliver a few things, good things. Thank you.
So that wraps up all the time we have. I'd like to try to put something on the calendar for next year so you can come back and give us an update on these projects. Thank you for all of you for joining us. Thank you, Secretary Kamau, Melanie, Alain, and Secretary Moniz. I hope you all can stick around. We'll have a little reception out in the lobby, and I think Ambassador Morningstar and Secretary Moniz will be regaling you about the Boston Red Sox, and also, if you're lucky, giving you a pitching lesson. So thank you all very much. Hope to see you next time.